Nobody in Coldwater expected Charlotte Brigham to walk into the feed store on a Tuesday morning and ask a man she barely spoke to whether he would marry her by Friday. Nobody expected Nathan Westbrook to say yes before she finished the sentence, but both things happened, and the town never quite recovered from either. The trouble had begun 3 weeks earlier, though Charlotte had seen it coming for much longer than that. Her father, Garrison Brigham, had built the Brigham land parcel with his own hands over 30 years. 200 acres pressed against the eastern slope of the mountain, good grazing land with a creek running clean through the lower field. When he died in the spring, he left it entirely to Charlotte, which should have been straightforward. It was not. A clause buried in the county land registry, written by a clerk who no longer worked there, stated that unmarried women could not hold sole title to property above a certain acreage without a male co-signatory or a lawful husband. The county assessor, a thin-lipped man named Gerald Foss, had discovered this clause with what Charlotte suspected was a little too much enthusiasm. She had 60 days to either marry or surrender partial title to the land. 43 of those days were already gone. Charlotte was not the kind of woman who panicked. She was the kind of woman who made lists, assessed options, and moved forward without flinching. But she had also spent the last 3 weeks watching every eligible man in Coldwater either avoid her eyes at church or show up at her door with motives that had nothing to do with helping her. 2 had already proposed, one who wanted the land and one who wanted something else entirely. She had turned them both away without raising her voice. Nathan Westbrook was different, and she knew it. That was precisely why she had avoided considering him for as long as she had. He worked a modest plot 2 miles north of town, not wealthy, not struggling. He kept to himself, not out of coldness, but out of habit. A man who had learned early that silence caused fewer problems than words. He was 34, unmarried, and as far as Charlotte could tell, entirely uninterested in other people's business. In a town like Coldwater, that last quality was rarer than gold. She found him stacking feed sacks near the back of Dormer's store, his coat dusted with grain, a pencil tucked behind one ear. She did not ease into it. Easing into things was not Charlotte Brigham's way. "I need a husband by Friday," she said. "A legal one. I need the name on a certificate, a signature at the county office, and a man willing to leave my land and my decisions entirely alone. I am not asking for anything beyond that." Nathan set down the sack he was holding. He looked at her for a moment, not with surprise, not with hunger, just with the calm, steady attention of someone who was actually listening. "Which parcel?" he asked. "The Brigham land, East Slope." He nodded slowly. "Foss giving you trouble over the registry clause?" She blinked. She had not expected him to know. "You're aware of it?" "I heard him mention it at the land office 2 weeks back. I figured he'd move on someone eventually." He picked up the pencil from behind his ear and turned it in his fingers. "What are the terms?" Charlotte had prepared for resistance, for negotiation, for the particular kind of male posturing she had encountered twice already that month. She had not prepared for a man who simply asked about terms. She straightened. "You keep your land, I keep mine. We appear in town as a married couple when necessary. You have no claim on the Brigham property, and I have no claim on yours. When the legal situation resolves itself, if it ever does, we discuss what comes next. And if it doesn't resolve itself, then we continue the arrangement." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the mountain pines with a sound like low breathing. Charlotte held his gaze because looking away first was not something she did. "All right," he said, just that. "All right." She had expected relief. Instead, standing there in the dusty light of Dormer's feed store, she felt something she could not immediately name, something faintly unsettling like the first tremor before a storm you hadn't seen coming. The ceremony was small on Wednesday, not Friday. Nathan had suggested moving it up without explaining why, and Charlotte hadn't asked. Judge Ambrose Holt performed it in his office with two witnesses pulled in from the hallway, a postal clerk and an older woman named Mrs. Ida Fenn, who smelled of lavender and cried anyway despite knowing nothing of the circumstances. Charlotte wore her good gray dress. Nathan wore a clean shirt and his better boots. They stood 2 feet apart and answered the required questions in clear, steady voices. When Judge Holt said Nathan could kiss his bride, Nathan looked at Charlotte with a question in his eyes rather than assumption. She gave the smallest nod she could manage. And he leaned in and pressed his lips briefly to her cheek. So briefly it barely registered. So carefully it registered completely. Mrs. Fenn dabbed her eyes. The postal clerk shook Nathan's hand. Charlotte signed the certificate with her maiden name out of habit, then corrected it. Charlotte Westbrook. She stared at the name for a moment longer than necessary before sliding the paper across the desk. The first week was practical. Nathan moved a portion of his things into the Brigham house, enough to satisfy appearances, not enough to crowd her. He took the small room off the kitchen that had once been her father's study. He asked where she kept the tool shed key, and he fixed the hinge on the barn door that had been dragging for 2 months without being asked. Charlotte noticed. She said nothing. They ate supper together each evening because that was what married people in Coldwater did, and people in Coldwater watched. The conversation was polite and spare. He asked about the creek fence. She asked about his north field. They passed bread and spoke about weather, and neither of them mentioned the arrangement or what it was or was not. On Thursday evening, a week after the ceremony, Charlotte came in from the lower field later than expected to find supper already made, not elaborate. Beans, cornbread, coffee on the stove, but made and set on the table with 2 plates, as though it were simply the natural order of things. She stood in the kitchen doorway, still in her work coat, looking at the table. Nathan was at the far end of the room, pulling on his jacket to go check the horses. He glanced at her. "Beans might be a little thick," he said. "I wasn't sure how long you'd be." Charlotte looked at the table again, then at him. "Thank you," she said. The words came out quieter than she intended. He nodded once and went out the back door. She sat down at the table alone, served herself from the pot he had left warm, and ate in the silence of a house that somehow felt less empty than it had the week before. That bothered her more than she was willing to admit. She had agreed to an arrangement. She had not agreed to notice things. She had not agreed to feel the particular inconvenient warmth of being considered by someone who had no obligation to consider her at all. Charlotte Brigham, Charlotte Westbrook, was a woman who kept her word, but she had told him what this was. She intended to hold to that, but the beans were good and the coffee was exactly the right strength. And outside, in the last gray light of a Colorado evening, she could hear Nathan moving quietly through her barn like a man who intended to stay. The second week brought snow, not the gentle, forgiving kind that settled soft on windowsills and made Coldwater look like something painted on a Christmas card. This was a Colorado mountain snow, heavy, sideways, the kind that found every gap in a wall and every weakness in a roof. It came down on Monday and did not stop until Wednesday afternoon, And by then the lower field was buried past the fence posts, and the creek had gone silent under a skin of gray ice. Charlotte had weathered worse, but she had always weathered it alone. Life alone had its own particular rhythm. You knew where everything was, you knew what needed doing and in what order. You did not have to account for another person moving through your space, making decisions alongside yours, existing in the corners of rooms you had always had entirely to yourself. Nathan shoveled the barn path before she was dressed. She discovered this when she came downstairs to do it herself and found it already done. The snow piled clean on either side, boot prints leading back to the kitchen door. She stood on the porch in the cold for a moment, shovel in hand, with nowhere particular to put her energy. It was a small thing. She told herself it was a small thing. By midweek, the snow had trapped them inside more than either of them was accustomed to. The trips to town were impossible, the field work suspended. Nathan spent the mornings doing what repairs the weather allowed, resealing a window frame, reinforcing a cellar shelf that had started to bow. Charlotte worked at the kitchen table with her father's land ledgers, cross-referencing grazing records she had been meaning to organize for months. They worked in the same spaces without planning to, without discussing it. On Wednesday evening, the fire in the main room burned low, and Charlotte went to add wood and found Nathan already there, crouched in front of the hearth with a log balanced in one hand, reading the fire the way men who have spent time outdoors learn to, watching where it needed feeding rather than just throwing wood at it. He didn't hear her come in. She stood for a moment in the doorway watching him and noticed, against her better judgment, the particular steadiness of him, the way he moved without hurry, the way he never seemed to be performing anything for anyone. She had known men who filled every room they entered with noise, opinions, laughter, the constant low hum of their own importance. Nathan Westbrook filled a room with something else entirely, a quality she didn't have a clean word for, reliability maybe, or just presence, the kind that didn't demand anything back. She stepped into the room and he heard her then and glanced over his shoulder. "Fire was getting low," he said. "I see that." She sat in the chair across from the hearth and opened the ledger she'd carried in. "Thank you." He settled back on his heels, watching the fire catch. Neither of them spoke for a while, and the snow pressed against the windows and the wood cracked, and the room held them both in its warmth without asking either of them to explain themselves. "You've been running this land alone since spring?" Nathan asked eventually. Not prying, just asking. "Since March," she said, "when my father passed." He nodded. "That's a long time to carry 200 acres by yourself." "I managed." "I know you did." He said it plainly without the faint condescension she was braced for. Not "you did well for a woman alone." Just an acknowledgement of fact. She glanced at him. He was still looking at the fire. "You never asked why I came to you," Charlotte said. The question surprised her as she said it. She hadn't planned to say it. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know." "I chose you," she said carefully, "because you seemed like a man who would honor the terms." He turned to look at her. Then the firelight caught the side of his face. "And do I?" "So far," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, close enough. Charlotte looked back down at her ledger. Her pulse was doing something she found entirely unreasonable. She pressed her finger against a column of figures and focused on the numbers until they steadied her. The snow cleared by Thursday, and with it came visitors. The first was Ida Fenn, the woman who had cried at their wedding, arriving with a jar of preserved peaches and an appetite for observation that she dressed up as neighborly concern. She sat at Charlotte's kitchen table for 40 minutes, eyes moving slowly around the room, cataloging whatever details she could carry back to town. Nathan came in from outside midway through the visit, hat in hand, and greeted Mrs. Fenn with a politeness so natural that Charlotte found herself studying him from across the room as though watching someone she hadn't fully seen before. "You've settled in nicely," Ida said to him with the tone of a woman delivering a verdict. "It's a good house," Nathan said. He set his hat on the hook by the door, the same hook Charlotte realized he'd been using all week without being told, as though he had always known it was his. After Ida left, Charlotte stood at the window watching the older woman pick her way down the snowy path toward the road. "She'll tell everyone in town exactly what she saw," Charlotte said. "Good," Nathan said from behind her matter-of-factly. "That's what she came for." Charlotte turned. "Does that not bother you?" He considered it honestly. "People watching me has never been my favorite thing, but if it keeps Foss from making trouble for your land, I'll survive." Charlotte looked at him for a moment. "You said your land." "I said your land," he corrected without hesitation. She held his gaze, he held hers. Neither of them looked away, and the moment stretched just long enough to become something neither of them was ready to name. "I'll start supper," Charlotte said and turned toward the stove. The second visitor was less welcome. Hector Doyle arrived on Friday afternoon on a horse that cost more than most men in Coldwater earned in a year. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with a rancher's hands and a businessman's eyes. He had been the first man to propose to Charlotte after her father died, the one who wanted the land, and he had not taken her refusal with any particular grace. He stood on the porch and looked past Charlotte when she opened the door, scanning the interior with the casual entitlement of someone who had not entirely accepted that a place was no longer available to him. "Heard you married Westbrook," he said. His tone made a quiet accusation of it. "You heard correctly," Charlotte said. "Seems fast." "Seems like my business," she said. Doyle's eyes moved to Nathan, who had appeared in the hallway behind her. Not aggressively, not making a show of it, just standing there with the unhurried stillness of a man who had every right to be in that hallway and knew it. The two men looked at each other. Something passed between them that Charlotte couldn't entirely read. Old acquaintance, maybe, or the particular tension of men who have measured each other before. "Westbrook," Doyle said. "Hector," Nathan replied. Doyle looked back at Charlotte. He smiled with his mouth only. "Well, congratulations, then." He turned and walked back to his horse without waiting for a response. Charlotte closed the door. She stood with her hand still on the handle, facing the wood grain, her jaw set. "He'll make trouble," she said quietly. "Probably," Nathan agreed. She turned. He was still in the hallway watching her with that calm, unreadable steadiness. And for just a moment, standing in the house her father had built, with snow still thick on the mountain and a man she barely knew positioned between her and whatever Hector Doyle intended to do next, Charlotte felt the full inconvenient weight of the fact that she was glad Nathan Westbrook was there. Not as an arrangement, not as a signature on a document, just there. She moved past him toward the kitchen and said nothing. But her hands, when she reached the counter, were not entirely steady, and she kept her back to the room until they were, because Charlotte Brigham had made a rule: no feelings, clean and simple, an arrangement, nothing more. The problem was that rules, she was beginning to discover, had very little power over the quiet, persistent truth of a thing already in motion. March came to Coldwater the way it always did in the mountains, not with warmth, but with the promise of it. The snow pulled back from the lower fields first, leaving the ground dark and wet and smelling of pine resin and cold earth, and the creek found its voice again beneath the ice, running under before breaking through. And by the second week, the Big Gam land showed the first pale green of early grass along the southern fence line. Charlotte noticed these things the way she always had, practically with an eye toward what they meant for the grazing schedule and the fence repairs and the creek crossing. But she also noticed them differently now, in a way she couldn't entirely account for, as though the land itself had shifted slightly on its axis. She knew, if she was honest, that it wasn't the land that had shifted. The arrangement had settled into something that had no clean name. They worked alongside each other through the week with a rhythm that had developed without discussion, Nathan handling the heavier fence repairs and the barn maintenance, with Charlotte managing the ledgers and the grazing rotations and the ongoing negotiations with the county assessor's office, which had grown quieter since the marriage certificate had been filed. Gerald Foss had not disappeared entirely, but he had stopped showing up unannounced, and that was enough for now. In the evenings, they shared the main room. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Charlotte had stopped finding the silence uncomfortable somewhere around the third week, which bothered her precisely because she remembered finding it uncomfortable and could not identify the exact moment it had changed. One evening in early March, she looked up from her ledger to find Nathan watching her, not staring. Just the kind of unhurried attention you give something you're trying to understand. And when she caught him, he didn't look away with embarrassment the way most men would have. He just held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at the window. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. Then, after a pause, "You hold your pen like it owes you something." Charlotte looked down at her hand. Her grip on the pen was, in fact, unnecessarily tight. She loosened it. "I wasn't aware I was being observed," she said. "I wasn't aware I was observing," he said. "It just happened." She looked at him for a long moment. He was almost smiling, almost. "Nathan Westbrook," she said carefully, "are you making a joke?" "I wouldn't know how," he said. But the almost smile stayed. Charlotte looked back at her ledger. She was, against every reasonable intention, smiling at the page. She pressed her lips together and did not allow it to fully form. But it was there, and she knew it was there, and the knowing of it sat warm and inconvenient in the center of her chest for the rest of the evening. The trouble, when it came, arrived through legal channels, which Charlotte supposed she should have expected from a man like Hector Doyle, who had learned early that paperwork could wound as cleanly as anything else. A letter arrived from a land attorney in Denver addressed to Gerald Foss and copied to Charlotte, raising a challenge to the validity of the marriage on the grounds that it had been contracted under duress and for the explicit purpose of circumventing county land law. The letter was careful and precise and clearly written by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Charlotte read it twice at the kitchen table and then set it flat on the wood and pressed both palms against it as though she could hold it down. Nathan came in from the barn, saw her face, and stopped. "What happened?" She slid the letter across the table without speaking. He read it standing up. His expression didn't change dramatically. It never did. But she had learned to read the smaller signals, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set. " Doyle," he said. "The attorney is from Denver." Doyle has money enough to hire the best ones. Nathan set the letter down. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. What do you need? Charlotte looked at him. The question was so direct, so entirely without drama that it caught her somewhere unguarded. What do you need? But not, this is bad, or I told you, or any of the things a man might say to remind a woman that her problem had become his problem. Just, what do you need? I need to prove the marriage is legitimate, she said. Which means I need people willing to testify that it is. That she paused. That we are, what? She met his eyes. A real couple, not an arrangement. The word arrangement landed in the room and sat there between them. It was the first time either of them had used it in weeks. Charlotte realized, hearing it out loud in Nathan's kitchen, in their kitchen, how thin it had started to sound, like a word that no longer fit the shape of the thing it was meant to describe. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Charlotte, he said. His voice was different, careful in a new way. But can I ask you something? You can try, she said. When you came into Dormer's store that morning, he stopped, started again. You said you chose me because I'd honor the terms. I did say that. Was that the only reason? The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, the March wind moved through the pines. Charlotte felt the question land somewhere deeper than she was prepared for and spent a moment doing what she always did when something threatened to outpace her. She held very still and waited for steadiness that did not quite come. No, she said finally, quietly, as though the word had been waiting a long time to be let out. It wasn't the only reason. Nathan looked at her, and for the first time since that Wednesday morning in Dormer's feed store, Charlotte saw something in his face that he hadn't taken care to conceal, something that had been sitting patient and undemanding behind his steadiness all this time, waiting for exactly this, for her to say something true before he said anything at all. I knew your father, Nathan said. Not well enough. He talked about you when he came to the land office, always the same way, like you were the most capable person he'd ever known and the most stubborn. The almost smile came back. He wasn't wrong about either. Charlotte felt something tighten in her throat. You never told me that, she said. You never asked about the only reason either, he said simply. She looked at the table, at the letter from Denver, at the grain of the wood her father had laid himself 30 years ago, at Nathan's hands resting flat on either side of the letter, steady and certain the way everything about him was steady and certain. I made rules, she said quietly. I know. They seemed reasonable at the time. Most rules do, he said. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that same unhurried attention, the kind that never demanded, never pushed, just waited with the patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed and had decided a long time ago that this particular thing was worth whatever wait it required. Charlotte Brigham had built her whole adult life on the understanding that needing someone was a vulnerability, and that vulnerability was a door best kept closed. She had watched her father grieve her mother for 20 years and had decided somewhere young and unspoken that love was a debt you paid with pieces of yourself you never got back. But sitting in this kitchen, in this house her father had left her, across the table from a man who had fixed her barn hinge without being asked and made beans that were exactly the right thickness and looked at her like she was worth the patience of a long winter, Charlotte found that the door she had been so careful to keep closed had been standing open for weeks, and she hadn't noticed. Or she had noticed and called it something else, the way stubborn people do when the truth is too inconvenient to look at directly. "Nathan," she said, "I don't know how to do this." "I know," he said. "Neither do I. Not really." He paused. "But I think we've already been doing it for a while." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He smiled fully this time, the way she had not seen him smile before, and it changed his face entirely, and she thought, without meaning to, that she would like very much to be the reason for that particular expression as often as possible. They rode into town together the following week and presented themselves at Judge Holt's office, not with a request to dissolve anything, but with 3 witnesses: Ida Fenn, the postmaster, and a rancher named George Alderman, who had watched Nathan repair Charlotte's fence line on 3 separate occasions, all of whom testified with considerable ease that the Westbrook marriage appeared genuine in every observable respect. Gerald Foss reviewed the documentation with visible disappointment. The Denver attorney's challenge was formally dismissed 2 weeks later. Hector Doyle did not contest it further. Some battles even proud men learned to leave alone. The wedding, the real one, the one that mattered, was not a ceremony. It happened on a Tuesday evening in April when the last of the snow was gone from the lower field and the creek was running full and clear. Charlotte came in from checking the fence line to find Nathan standing on the porch watching the mountain turn gold in the last of the daylight. She stood beside him without being asked. He reached over without looking and took her hand. She let him. They stood like that for a long time without speaking. Later that spring, on a Saturday morning with the windows open and the smell of pine coming down off the mountain, Nathan asked her properly. No arrangement, no terms, no clauses, just him and her, and a question shaped like the truest thing he knew how to say. Charlotte said yes before he finished asking. She did not apologize for it. They were married again quietly, just the 2 of them and Judge Holt, because Charlotte said once was enough for the county, and this time was for something else entirely. And if Ida happened to be passing the courthouse window at exactly the right moment and cried for the second time over 2 people she barely knew, well, Coldwater was a small town. Some things could not be helped. By the following year, the Brigham land carried the name Westbrook on its eastern fence post, painted there by Nathan on a dry afternoon in June, while Charlotte watched from the gate with her arms folded and said nothing about it, which was, he had learned, her particular way of saying everything. The ledgers balanced, the creek ran well, the lower field greened up earlier that spring than it had in years. And on a cold, clear morning in October, with the mountain showing its first color and the kitchen smelling of coffee and wood smoke, Charlotte set down her pen mid-column, looked across the room at her husband, and said entirely without planning to, "I'm glad it was you." Nathan looked up. "In Dormer's store," she said. "I'm glad it was you I asked." He held her gaze for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, "I know. I've known for a while." "Insufferable," she said. "Probably," he agreed. She went back to her ledger. He went back to whatever he was doing. The fire held, the mountain stood, and somewhere in the house, small and new and entirely unplanned, the sound of a baby beginning to stir carried through the thin wall from the next room. Their daughter, 6 weeks old, named Garrison, after the man who had built this land and talked about his stubborn, capable girl like she was the finest thing he'd ever known. Charlotte set down her pen again. Nathan was already standing. "I'll get her," he said. "I know you will," Charlotte said softly, and she watched him go. This man who had said yes before she finished asking, who had fixed things without being told and waited without being asked, and loved her in the steady, unhurried way of someone who had decided long before she had that this was exactly where he intended to be. The marriage had been pretend. Every single thing that followed was real.